University Family History Library webinar series. Feel free to use the chat box for any questions during the presentation. If we are unable to answer them during the presentation, then they will be answered at the end. My name is Maddie Acey. I will be your host for this webinar. Today we will be pleased to hear from Heather Pack, who will be giving a presentation titled How to Write a Compelling Story About Your Ancestor. Heather Ruth Pack became interested in family history at the young age of 12. After taking genealogy classes at BYU, she put her research skills to work to find her great-grandfather's true identity. She finally found him 24 years later, learning many of the tools and tricks of the trade and collecting several hundred stories along the way. Her family history blogs are read by thousands around the world and have been featured on several genealogical sites, inspiring others to go find stories from their own family tree. She is a frequent guest lecturer and a published author. Heather received her master's degree in public administration at BYU and the Marriott School of Management, where she taught communication classes for several years to hundreds of millennials. Currently, she serves as a family search support missionary for the LDS Church. And now we will turn the time.
Thank you, Maddie. So I'd like to begin by, let's see, this isn't advancing. Okay. So I'd like to begin by just briefly talking about the last webinar I gave, which was how to get the younger generation, commonly known as millennials, excited about family history. And I chose this picture because I think sometimes this is what it feels like when we're trying to reach these younger kids. They seem more interested in their screens than they are in talking to humans. And so what this webinar is to help us reach these kinds of people, to help them put these devices down so that they will want to hear the stories of their ancestors. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. There's actually 4 parts to this webinar. The first thing I'm going to address is finding a storyteller. And then I'm going to talk about finding a story. And then I'm going to share some ways that we can actually create a story, and then how we can share that story with others. So first, let's talk about finding a storyteller. There's actually 3 places or 3 sources that we can look to when looking for a storyteller. The first is our deceased ancestors. And sometimes we may think, well, how do we get them to tell us a story from the grave? I have found actually they do leave a trail of stories behind. And it is, if with some digging and some research, we can find the stories that they have to tell us, even though that they have passed on. These stories are so valuable, especially for those who are younger, because this can inspire them and motivate them and help them see that they too can reach their own goals as they learn about those who came before them. Another great source is our living relatives, those who have the stories and are still here to share them. And what's wonderful about living relatives is they can tell these stories in their own words. Some of the challenges with that is sometimes they can be forgetful, they can leave out certain details, or maybe not tell us exactly the way it happened, but more just from their perspective. But the benefit of getting our stories from our living relatives is we can interact with them, we can ask questions, we can get clarifications, unlike with our deceased ancestors. But really, I have found that the greatest source in finding a storyteller is looking at ourselves. Sometimes we forget that we are our own greatest resource. Every single one of us has an interesting story to tell. And whether it's something that's happened to us or an experience that we've had with one of our ancestors, we should never forget that we have the ability to tell these great stories from our own personal experiences. So when it comes to finding a storyteller, there's different ways that we can extract these stories out of them. So with a deceased ancestor, we can look at journals and see what they've written down. We can interview their descendants, the ones who knew them when they were still alive. We can also look at historical events. Sometimes I have found many journals and documents and publications, newspapers that We'll talk about my ancestors. One of my most exciting sources was I discovered that one of my ancestors actually was a missionary in France for the Baptist church. There's really, I have found two effective ways to find out their stories. One is to just sit down and interview them. And the most important thing to do when you're interviewing a relative is to have a way of recording it. There are lots of apps on your cell phones that you can use or tape recorders, but there's so much you can't capture by just writing down what they're saying. You really want to try to capture their voice, capture their inflection. That way you can get every word. If that isn't an option, another thing you can do is send them out a survey. I remember years ago when I was in high school, I sent out a questionnaire to my mother and all of her siblings about what life was like in Price, Utah. And I just wrote out several questions, pages of them, and they filled it all out and mailed it back to me. And from that, I was able to get many stories. When it comes to getting a story from your own life, look through your own journals, see what you've written in the past. Also, don't be afraid to record yourself. Record your story so that others can hear it at a later time. But one thing I caution you when it comes to looking for stories from these storytellers is try to focus on just one event from the storyteller's life. Don't try to capture everything they've ever done from the beginning to the end. We sometimes we want to get the full picture of this individual, and we don't want to leave anything out. But we need to look at a person's life as if they're a photo album. Imagine going through this photo album. Every single picture in this photo album is a different story. So it would be overwhelming to hand this photo album to someone else and say, here, look at all these pictures so that you can get to know somebody. But if you just grab a single snapshot, each of those pictures has its own story. And so try to find one story from a single picture and build a story from that. Hopefully, if that story is compelling enough, the reader will want to know more about that individual and eventually go through the whole photo album themselves. When it comes to finding the story from the storyteller, so often people will say, oh, nothing ever interesting happened to me. I don't have any stories. But that is not true. Every single person has a story. So I broke down three main categories that I have found have created really compelling stories. The first category is a decision. So many times in our life, we are faced with a decision. And especially when you're looking for stories about ancestors who are deceased, and it's hard to interview them because, obviously you can't, look for times in their lives when most likely they had to make a decision. For instance, did they ever at one point have to leave their homeland and immigrate to a different country or a different part of their country? Did they ever change religions or join a religion? Did they ever enlist in the military? Did they fight in a war? These major events in their lives can create some very compelling stories. Also, look for days that would have been different from any other day. Was there a tragic event that happened in their life? What did they do for a holiday or a special celebration? What were those days like? I found a fantastic story about one of my ancestors where she just detailed what Christmas was like for her. Her first Christmas away from home. And it may have seemed kind of boring to her at the time when she wrote it, but from that I was able to learn so much about my ancestor and what life was like back then. Or look for times when there was a birth or a death in the family. These are major changes for a family. And for an individual, my great-grandfather had to bury two of his children just 10 days apart. And from that came just a riveting and very inspiring yet sad story. Another way that you can find stories from people is look at their routine. What were their chores like? What did they have to do for work? What was a typical school day like for them? Or what were some traditions that they practiced? I know my kids asked me one time, "Mom, what did you do when you were my age?" And I thought about it and I realized I spent a lot of time hanging out at the mall. And so from that, I wrote a story called Mesilla Valley Mall Rats. And it has turned out to become one of my most popular stories because so many people my age also would hang out at the mall, particularly those who hung out at the Mesilla Valley Mall. And they all loved the story because it brought back so many memories for them. And now I want to talk about how to create a story. And there's many elements that go into a compelling story. And I'm not suggesting that every story you ever create needs to have all of these elements, but a story that does contain every single one of these elements will be the most compelling. So what I'm going to do is break down all these different elements by showing you snippets of different stories that I've written so that you can get a better sense of how these can be incorporated into a story. This might seem like it's actually a very sad and depressing story, but it's not. This story is actually very funny. But I wanted to engage the reader and get them interested in this story by setting up the scene as how the story ended instead of how the story began. So as you can see, we're all gathered around my mother's casket. We're about to say goodbye to her one last time. And then I made a confession. And I said, "Mom, I have something to tell you." And then I go back in time and I begin the story at the beginning in 1976. This is a way to grab the reader's attention because now they know something's coming where I'm going to have to confess something that I did. Here's another example of a hook that I used. I wanted to tell the reader that it was through a series of events that were really quite random and disconnected that actually made it to the point where I could be born. And so I wanted to get them thinking about this idea, and so I introduced the idea of a butterfly effect. And so by asking this rhetorical question, have you ever heard of the butterfly effect? It gets them thinking, well, what is the butterfly effect? How does it work? How does it apply to this story? And then I connect it to what I call the Dusty Bible effect. In this story, I wanted the reader to know that my ancestor received a pardon from the President of the United States right before Christmas, which released him from jail. And I wanted to show just what a big deal that was. And so I got the reader thinking, can you imagine what it would be like if you received a Christmas present from the President of the United States? And so this puts the reader into the ancestor's shoes. When it comes to setting, you want to create a setting so that the reader can understand the time period, what's going on, where we are with this ancestor. In this story, I'm actually telling a story about a castle. So to help them understand just how old this castle is, I give them a link to the person who was reigning at the time, Alexander III, and I also give a time frame. I want them to understand that this castle has been around for over 1,000 years and that it's really old. And so I set up this setting to kind of help the reader see, here's the castle I'm going to tell you about. In this story, it's very sad, and I'm talking about how a person named Francis was left behind in England when the family moved to Utah. So in this paragraph, I wanted to help the reader understand the time period. So I included the year, I included names, I included how these people were related to Francis, and I also include the place where Francis was living at the time. In order for a story to be the most compelling, you want to create some conflict or some tension. This is going to keep the reader engaged and get them to want to read it to the very end. Conflict can come from many places. In this story, my ancestor gets in trouble with the King of England. Eventually, he's actually beheaded by the king. But at the beginning, I want to show this tension that came because my ancestor joined the Quaker religion, and this was disturbing and upsetting to the King of England. And so I begin this story by showing the tension that was coming externally from the King of England to my ancestor. But sometimes the tension can come because someone's in danger or there's a tragic event or something bad is happening. In this story, my ancestor actually saved the life of the King of Scotland. And so it creates this conflict or this tension of how is it that my ancestor is going to be able to save the King of Scotland's life. But not all conflict needs to come from an outside source. Sometimes conflict can come from an internal source or a struggle that we have within ourselves. This is a story about a time when my father needed to let his employer know that he had to go back on a promise that he had made to this employer. And so you can imagine how difficult and how challenging this was for him. But even that tension can grab a reader. How is he going to do it? What's going to be the result? What's going to happen in the end? Before I had mentioned to you about one of my most popular stories, and that was hanging out at the Mesilla Valley Mall. Well, in one of the reasons why that story was so interesting is because I was able to include very specific details as to what it was like to be at the mall. And so here I have a picture of what we looked like when we used to hang out at the mall. I also later include pictures of stores that we went to. One of the stories I wrote was about a woman who was like a second mother to me. I loved this woman, and I wanted the reader to know this is what it was like to hang out at this woman's house. And so if you'll see in this snippet here, I go into great detail as to what it was like to have a birthday party at this woman's house. She would let us play with cookie dough. And so instead of saying, well, she let us play with cookie dough, I actually talk about we would cut it into different shapes, we would ball it up, we could move it around, and then we could clump it all together and then do it again. And then we even got to eat the cookie dough without even baking it. That gives a lot more detail and helps the reader experience it more than just, oh, we got to play with some cookie dough. Another thing that this wonderful woman would do is she would make grape Kool-Aid, pour it in Dixie cups, stick a stick in the middle, cover it with plastic wrap, freeze it. Then once it was frozen, give it to us. We would peel the cup off of the frozen Kool-Aid, and then we got to lick it out in the backyard. Those details are much more engaging than just to say, oh, at Mary's house, we got to eat grape popsicles. Another thing that will help the reader understand the story is if you provide some context as to what was going on during their time. So in the story that I mentioned before about the first Christmas away from home, well, she actually only lived 3 hours by car away from her mother. And so in today's world, it would be like, what's the big deal? Why don't you just get in your car and go see your mom? But back then, it was a 3-week trip by horse and buggy. And this will help the reader understand why she felt so lonely and why she was so sad during this first Christmas away from her mom. In this story, I talk about how an ancestor actually had to buy his freedom from his father. The cost was $150, which he paid when he was 15 years old. Now, teenagers who are 15 may think $150, that's not that big of a deal. But back then it really was. So what I did is I converted that $150 into today's dollars so that readers could understand this 15-year-old was actually paying a lot of money for his freedom. Now, going back to the conflict or the tension, in order for the reader to feel satisfied or to enjoy the story, There needs to be a resolution. That conflict or that tension needs to end in some way, or else it's going to leave the reader feeling angst or not happy with how the story ends, kind of like a cliffhanger. In this story that I tell about Lavinia and James, James was actually murdered in a horrific way, and it's really sad. And so there really isn't a happy ending to the story. So what I did is I looked for a resolution to this conflict so that the reader could feel satisfied. And I talk about how almost 100 years later, they were able to be sealed for eternity in the Ogden Temple. That way the reader won't end feeling depressed. In this story, which is actually pretty funny, there still is some conflict that's created because my dad got into a fight with a little boy named Bobby. And even though it turned out his eyeball didn't fall out of the socket and go down the drain, I resolved the conflict from the fight by just saying, and Dad was never allowed to play with Bobby again, which is kind of a humorous way to resolve that conflict. I want to just, before we go on to the next section, I want to just give a warning that when you write a story, sometimes it's tempting to make the lessons obvious to the reader. And this is why you should never, or we should always, but I warn you not to do that because readers don't want to feel like they're being preached at. Trust the story. Let the lessons emerge on their own. Different readers are going to take different meanings from the actions of their ancestors, and just allow that to happen. We don't need to preach to them the lessons learned from the stories. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is sharing a story. Now, I've found that there's lots of ways to share a story, but I'm going to address 3 different ways. One is we can share it electronically, we can share them at family gatherings, or we can publish the stories into a book. And I have the circles overlap so that you can see that when you are at family gatherings, that is a great place where you can share stories both electronically and in the published form. But first I want to talk about the electronic ways to share a story. This is a fantastic way to get your stories out to all of those who you think might be interested in them. Some of the advantages to this is the cost is very low. It doesn't cost anything to publish something on a blog or in an email. It's very easy to distribute. It's easy to share. It can just be a matter of a link. And it's also interactive. I know I have friends who share their stories on Facebook, allowing the grandkids to ask questions in the comment section below. So some of the ways that you can do it is to send out an email with a story attached, or create a blog like I do. Or you can use Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Lots of different social media platforms are a great way to share a story. Or you can just write an ebook, and then anybody who wants to can download that ebook and read it on their own devices. Family gatherings is a really fun place to share stories, like at a reunion or any time the family is gathered for a birthday party or something. One of the things that makes family gatherings a great solution is they're really fun and it's really interactive. You've got lots of people there. It's a very personal way to share a story. People can ask questions and laugh, and it's just a really fun way to get the stories out there. Some of the ways that you can share a story is put on a skit, have the younger kids act out the older grandparents or great-grandparents, or make it as formal as a play. Or you can even write a story that has all the audience engaged, like at a Cub Scout roundtable meeting or at a PAC meeting or something. One time I did a story at a Christmas party, and every time we said the word Grandpa Bill, everybody had to stand up and say, "He's this tall," because he's a really tall man. Or every time we used the word right, everybody had to move to the right. Or if I said the word left, everybody had to move to the left. And it kept the kids engaged and interested in the story. Or just like you have bedtime Stories at bedtime, you can have a story time where everyone gathers and you read stories. Instead of from a book, you just read stories from your ancestor's life. The other right way to share a story is just get it published in a book. One of the advantages of this is permanent. It can't be lost through a file or, corrupted with a virus or a bug. It's also tactile. This is something people can touch, flip the pages, put their hands over the picture. However, some of the disadvantages to publishing in a book is it's very expensive. It also can be overwhelming for people to read an entire book full of stories. And because they're so expensive, it's hard to get enough copies for all of those who want it. I have seen that books typically become very expensive once the book is about 30 to 40 years old, because now the third generation want it and there's just not enough of the book to go around. So I want to review what we've talked about today in this webinar. First, we talked about trying to find the storyteller. And as you remember, we can look to our deceased ancestors, we can interview and talk to our living relatives, or even ourselves, look through our own journals, or think about experiences we've had with ancestors who've gone before. And then we talked about how to find a story. Some of the best ways to find a story is look for a time when someone had to make a big decision, or when there was a day that was different than any other. Or look for something that was just a typical routine day that might be different than what the reader experiences now. Then we went through all the different elements that go into creating a compelling story. If you remember, it should have a hook so that we can grab the reader's attention, and a setting so that we can explain to the reader what the time period is and what's going on at the time. We want to create conflict or tension for the main character to have to overcome. And details and context will help the reader feel involved. And then, of course, we want to end the story by resolving that conflict or that tension in some way. And then last, we talked about all the different ways that you can share a story. You want to make sure that you're sharing the story in a way so that it's meaningful for the reader or for the listener. So keep in mind, a little 4-year-old is going to want to hear a story very differently than maybe someone who's 22 years old. So whenever you're creating a story, always keep your audience in mind and share it in a way that the audience can receive it best. Today I've shared with you many of different stories that I have, and I just wanted to let you know that if you want to read any of these stories online, they're available on a website called A Certain Englishman's Wife at .blogspot.com. And at the beginning of the page, you'll see I have different tabs where I've divided my stories based on which ancestors I'm talking about. So A Certain Englishman's Wife are stories about my own life or my children or my husband. My Mother's Family is stories about my mom and her ancestors. And then there's my dad and his ancestors. And then my husband, who's known as A Certain Englishman, I have stories about his ancestors as well. And if you click on those different tabs, maybe you'll be able to find all these different stories I mentioned today and see how I've incorporated these different elements that we've talked about. You'll notice not every single one of the stories I've written has all of these elements, but you'll probably see that I do try to incorporate as many of them as I can. You'll also notice that I try and use humor to break up the emotional tension in what can otherwise be quite a sad or depressing story. I want the reader to feel like they're reading about an actual person who loved, laughed, and sometimes even cried. Thank you so much for listening to this webinar. I hope you found it informational, and I hope you enjoy reading some stories and also creating some compelling stories of your own.